Hi again. It's time for chapter 19. And chapter 19 is really short, but boys and girls, it's sad, it's tough. And so I was doing a little bit of background reading on it, a little bit of reading about Kate DiCamillo. And she was asked once, why does she always put sadness in her stories and mean people in her stories? And she wrote that she wants to be truthful with her readers. And the truth is, for her, life did get tough sometimes, and she wanted to be honest and share that might happen. There might be hard things, but that we're stronger than we think, and we're going to be okay. And she shared the story of a friend of hers, a good friend, who loved Charlotte's Web when she was a little girl. Maybe you were like that, or a little boy even. And she would take Charlotte's Web and read it over and over and over again. So Kate DiCamillo asked her, why did you do that? You knew it was sad. You knew that it was hard. Why did you keep reading it? And I'll just share a little bit about her friend's response. I knew that a terrible thing was going to happen. And I knew it was going to be okay somehow. I thought I couldn't bear it. But then when I read it again, it was all so beautiful. And I found out I could bear it. That's what the story told me. That was what I needed to hear, and that's why I kept reading it. And mixed with that great sorrow, there's also great love. And lastly, I just want to add too that this is just a fictional story. It's not true. It's all made up. Okay, so even though it's sad, it's not a true story. All right, it's time for chapter 19. The days passed. The sun rose and set and rose and set again and again. Sometimes the father came home and sometimes he did not. Edward's ears became soggy and he didn't care. His sweater had almost completely unraveled and it didn't bother him. He was hugged half to death, and it felt good. In the evenings at the hands of Bryce, at the ends of the twine, Edward danced and danced. 1 month passed, and then 2, and then 3. Sarah Ruth got worse. In the 5th month, she refused to eat, and in the 6th month, she began to cough up blood. Her breathing became ragged and uncertain, as if she was trying to remember in between breaths what to do, what breathing was. Breathe, honey, Bryce stood over her and said. Breathe, thought Edward from deep inside the well of her arms. Please, please breathe. Bryce stopped leaving the house. He sat at home all day and held Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her back and forth and sang to her. On a bright morning in September, Sarah Ruth stopped breathing. Oh no, said Bryce. Oh honey, take a little breath, please. Edward had fallen out of Sarah Ruth's arms the night before, and she had not asked for him again. So face down on the floor, arms over his head, Edward listened as Bryce wept. He listened as the father came home and shouted at Bryce. He listened as the father wept. You can't cry, Bryce shouted. You got no right to cry. You never even loved her. You don't know nothing about love. I loved her, said the father. I loved her. I loved her too, thought Edward. I loved her and now she is gone. How could this be? He wondered. How could he bear to live in a world without Sarah Ruth? The yelling between the father and son continued, and then there was a terrible moment when the father insisted that Sarah Ruth belonged to him, that she was his girl, his baby, and that he was taking her to be buried. She ain't yours, Bryce screamed. You can't take her. She ain't yours. But the father was bigger and stronger, and he prevailed. He wrapped Sarah Ruth in a blanket and carried her away. The small house became very quiet. Edward could hear Bryce moving around, muttering to himself. And then finally, the boy picked Edward up. "Come on, Jangles," Bryce said. "We're leaving. We're going to Memphis." Here's Bryce and Jangles on their way to Memphis. And let's just keep reading. We can't leave it there. Chapter 20. "How many dancing rabbits have you seen in your life?" Bryce said to Edward. "I can tell you how many I've seen. 1, you. That's how you and me are going to make some money. I seen it the last time I was in Memphis. Folks put on any kind of show right there on the street corner, and people pay 'em for it. I seen it." The walk to town took all night. Bryce walked without stopping, carrying Edward under one arm and talking to him the whole time. Edward tried to listen, but the terrible scarecrow feeling had come back. The feeling he had when he was hanging by his ears in the old lady's garden. The feeling that nothing mattered, that nothing would ever matter again. And not only did Edward feel hollow, he ached. Every part of his china body hurt. He ached for Sarah Ruth. He wanted her to hold him. He wanted to dance for her. And he did dance, but it was not for Sarah Ruth. Edward danced for strangers on a dirty street corner in Memphis. Bryce played his harmonica and moved Edward's strings, and Edward bowed and shuffled and swayed, and people stopped to stare and point and laugh. On the ground in front of them was Sarah Ruth's button box. The lid was open to encourage people to drop change inside it. "Mama," said a small child, "look at that bunny. I want to touch him." He reached out his hand for Edward. "No," said the mother, "dirty." She pulled the child back away from Edward. "Nasty," she said. A man wearing a hat stopped and stared at Edward and Bryce. "It's a sin to dance," he said. And then after a long pause, he said, "It's a particular sin for rabbits to dance." The man took off his hat and held it over his heart. He stood and watched the boy and the rabbit for a long time. Finally, he put his hat back on his head and walked away. The shadows lengthened. The sun became an orange, dusty ball low in the sky. Bryce tried to cry. Edward saw his tears land on the pavement. But the boy did not stop playing his harmonica. He did not make Edward stop dancing. An old woman leaning on a cane stepped up close to them. She stared at Edward with deep, dark eyes. "Pellegrina?" thought the dancing rabbit. She nodded at him. "Look at me," he said to her, his arms and legs jerked. "Look at me. You got your wish. I have learned how to love. And it's a terrible thing. I'm broken. My heart is broken. Help me." The old woman turned and hobbled away. "Come back," thought Edward. "Fix me." Bryce cried harder. He made Edward dance faster. Finally, when the sun was gone and the streets were dark, Bryce stopped playing his harmonica. "I'm done now," he said. He let Edward fall to the pavement. "I ain't going to cry anymore." Bryce wiped his nose and eyes with the back of his hand. He picked up the button box and looked inside it. "We got us enough money to get something to eat," he said. "Come on, Jangles."